After the Battle of Trenton, the famous Christmas Eve defeat of the Hessians, George Washington wanted another bold move to show the British he meant business, and to prevent the British from crossing the Delaware, entering Pennsylvania, and taking the capital of Philadelphia. He received intelligence that the British were heading to Trenton to smash his army.
Washington crossed the Delaware the night, Christmas Eve, December 25th, 1776. About 4,000 soldiers carried out a remarkable campaign to surround these Hessian forces in Trenton and force them to surrender. 7 days after the British defeat in the Battle of Trenton, Washington succeeded in crushing the British forces at Princeton. And this battle, the Battle of Princeton, was one of the most important and significant battles fought in the history of the United States military.
Freedom rings.
The Battle of Princeton was one of the most decisive early battles in the history of the American Revolution. Unfortunately, most Americans never heard of this extraordinary battle of wits between General George Washington and Major General Lord Cornwallis. In this battle, the Americans outsmarted and outmaneuvered the British in every way. We're here at Washington's Crossing. This is where Washington crossed the Delaware in the first Battle of Trenton, where he destroyed and defeated the Hessians. He came back to this spot with prisoners and then re-entered New Jersey across the river for the Battle of Princeton. And we have with us here today Mr. Stephen Combe, who will be asking questions about that important battle in American history. Tell us what the British were doing while Washington was getting ready to invade Princeton.
On the morning of the 2nd, Lord Cornwallis, the British general, had massed his forces in Princeton and was marching south 10 miles on the main road to Trenton. However, the road was very muddy because it had been raining, and he had a lot of trouble getting his baggage train and his cannons down that road, and that was multiplied by the fact that Washington deployed his seasoned veteran frontiersmen under Colonel Edward Hand to snipe at Cornwallis's army from behind the trees, inflicting many casualties. And so the combination of these two meant that Cornwallis did not arrive in Trenton till about dark. Now at that point, Washington had built trenches on the south end of Trenton, on the south side of the Assunpunk Creek, and there was only one very narrow bridge across that creek. And otherwise, Cornwallis was stuck in the position of having to have his men ford the creek under fire from Washington's men in their trenches, and then try to charge up this side of the creek. They tried that 3 times and were repulsed. And at that point, Cornwallis had a council with his chief officers and said, I'm going to wait and have my troops get rested overnight, and then we will assault all up and down the river, the creek, and in the morning, and take Washington, and I will bag the fox.
Washington deployed 500 of his troops to stay on the line all night long, keeping fires burning, working with pickaxes and shovels, making lots of noise, giving the British Army the idea that the Americans were preparing their defenses for the British attack the next day. But while these 500 Americans were actively working to deceive the British, the majority of Washington's army began moving after dark along a road that ran to the south of the creek, about 7 to 8 miles, and then crossed and headed once again north towards the rear guard of the British Army in Princeton.
If Washington had stayed behind his trenches in Trenton until the next morning, the morning of the 3rd, Cornwallis would have had his whole army of 6,000 men cross over the creek at multiple points. Cornwallis would have surrounded Washington's force, many of whom were untested militiamen who had never been in a battle. He had 6,000 hardened, trained professional soldiers. And in a head-on-head battle, he absolutely would have defeated Washington, destroyed his army, and the revolution would have been lost right then and there.
The army arrived early in the morning, at dawn, 7 o'clock in the morning, and caught the British rearguard, about 1,500 British regulars, in Princeton. 2 of these regiments had already been called upon by Cornwallis to move to Trenton to be part of the attack the next morning. As they were moving along the road towards Trenton, they were intercepted by General Mercer. His job was to close off the road to make sure that the British didn't get out of Princeton. He ran into 2 regiments of British regulars moving down the road on their way to reinforce Cornwallis at Trenton, and immediately moved to engage them. In this conflict, the better trained British regulars repulsed the American militia and in the process killed General Mercer. Washington arrived on the battlefield shortly after Mercer was killed with the Virginia and Pennsylvania Continental soldiers and put them into battle formation and rode ahead of them to stop the militia who were retreating from the British and asked them to march with him that day. He said that the British were fewer in number and they would be defeated very quickly, and he was able to rally the militia from their retreat to fall into line with the Continentals and return into the battle, and Washington personally led the army to within 30 yards of the British line.
And one officer on Washington's army later recounted that he put his hat over his face because he was sure that when the smoke from all the firing cleared, that he would see Washington lying dead on the ground. But when the smoke cleared, there was Washington, still there, as the officer later stated, supreme in his belief that divine providence would protect him.
After driving back the British reinforcements under Lieutenant Charles Mahood that had been coming up to join Cornwallis, Washington entered the town. There, Artillery Captain Alexander Hamilton's cannons were brought to bear on Nassau Hall.
Colonel Alexander Hamilton set up his cannon for his artillery approximately at this spot and hit the wall of Nassau Hall with a cannonball, and the next shot went through a window, and it is claimed that it decapitated a portrait of King George II, at which point the British soldiers inside surrendered, finishing the complete victory by Washington and his army at the Battle of Princeton.
The victories at Trenton and Princeton forced a newfound respect by the British toward the American army. Here's what some of the British officers had to say.
Poor devils, as the rebel generals are, they out-generaled us more than once, even since I've been here, which is only 6 weeks. And it is no less certain that with a tolerable degree of common sense and some ability in our commanders, the rebellion would now be near ended. Lord Cornwallis, I believe, is a brave man, but he allowed himself to be fairly out-generaled by Washington, the 4th of January last at Trenton, and missed a glorious opportunity when he let Washington slip away in the night. I have no occasion to add that though it was once the fashion of this army to treat them in the most contemptible light, they are now become a formidable enemy.